I remember once when I was preaching at a church, I went to visit a member in the hospital, and that person's family was there. And at one point, someone in the family asked me, "Steve, will you lead us in the Lord's Prayer?" And I have to confess, I was caught off guard a little bit. Like, oh, I know that. I've got it memorized pretty well, but I do better if I start it versus someone just, says, "Hey, do it right now." And then there's always the question, okay, which verbiage, our Father in heaven, our Father which art in heaven, and other things. And so it made me a little nervous there. The real problem with the Lord's Prayer, actually there's a couple. And the first one is, it's not the Lord's Prayer. The Lord is Jesus, and His prayer would be something He prayed for specifically to happen. And that's found in a different part of the Gospels. We'll look at that in a later blog. But the big problem here is it's not meant to be recited as we often do. We call it let's say the Lord's Prayer. And sometimes we do that just because it's a habit. I used to preach at a church where this was recited every Sunday after the offering was collected. Well, Jesus has just said prior to this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, He just said, don't pray like the Gentiles do, using empty phrases, things they repeat over and over and have sort of lost their meaning. This is meant to be, and I call it, the model prayer. Our prayer should include these elements. That's why when Jesus introduces it in Matthew 6:9, He says, pray then like this. Let this guide your prayer time with God. The NIV says this then is how you should pray, not necessarily what you should pray. These are elements that should constitute our prayer time with God. And so to do that, we need to understand them, know what they mean. And I think we also need to pay attention to the order, that there's a progression here that should guide us that is appropriate to prayer. And so there's a lot of good books, good lessons on the model prayer. I want to give you my thoughts over the next several blogs, and I pray they would help you in your prayer time. Well, the first element of prayer Jesus starts off with is our Father in heaven. And I have to confess about this too, a lot of confession today, that as I thought about this at first, like years ago, it was sort of just like a quick introduction. Hey God, I'm getting ready to pray now. But it's not. It's more than that. And when you understand exactly what it is, it helps set the tone for our prayer. The tone of what I pray, but also the tone for me as I approach God in prayer. Jesus says, pray our Father in heaven. And realize, we could pray just God. We could use some other name. But in using our Father, Jesus wants us to think about something that's inherent in a father. What does it require to be a father? Well, you have to have children, right? You have to have that relationship. And so that's the first thing that should come to our mind. I'm praying to God, who is our Father. He has done everything to have a relationship with us. It's why He created. It's why the Son came to redeem us. It's all about that relationship. That's the first lens that helps me, have that perspective. And then as I think about our Father, hopefully what comes to mind is a father loves their children. A father loves their children. And I realize as a father myself, an earthly father, my love for my children isn't perfect. But Jesus adds our Father in heaven. And so that brings in the idea, this is God we're talking about. He is perfect in every way, including His love. And so I think about this God who has perfect love for me. And then also, since He is God, since He is the divine creator and sustainer, hopefully what else comes to mind is God's power. And whenever I talk about God's power, I always use it in the context of His control. God's not only all-powerful, He knows all. He's all-knowing. He's aware of what's happening all the time in my life and others and the world in general. And then not just His knowledge, but His wisdom. He knows what's best to happen. He knows what should happen and how to bring it about. And so God's all-knowing, He's all-wise, and then you add He's all-powerful. He's able to bring it about. That's what I refer to as God's control. And so here you see these two traits that I say are just so basic as we, think about our relationship with God. He is in control and He loves me all the time, perfectly and totally. And so that gives a perspective to my prayer. And I'm praying to the God who wants a relationship. And in this relationship, He is in total control. I can trust that. And He loves me completely, unconditionally, totally, perfectly. I can trust that as well. It gives a perspective for my prayer. It gives a perspective for life. And then even that first word "our," don't just brush over that. It could just as easily be "my Father in heaven," because He is my Father. But in using "our," Jesus reminds us of something that we can often forget. I refer to it as sort of the "you understood" principle of the New Testament. You remember from your maybe middle school grammar days that, "you understood" in grammar is you don't always have to start the sentence with "you." Pick up the bucket, please. I'm speaking to you to do that. I don't have to say "you pick up the bucket." Well, it's the same thing in the New Testament. It doesn't always come out and tell us. It's speaking to us as not a personal individual Christian, but it's speaking to me in my part of the body of Christ. I'm joined to other Christians, and so it's talking to us. There's that community, body dynamic that's there, but it's not always spelled out. It's understood, or since it's not oftentimes for us today, it's unfortunately you misunderstood. And so Jesus wants us to know that. And throughout the prayer here, He's going to use the plural pronouns. So that's the first thing, the first element of this prayer. What's it look like then? This is our model. Okay, so as I go to pray to God, how does this shape my prayer? Well, the first thing, our Father in heaven. One, it starts with the focus on God. And that's important because very often, even when we just think of prayer, what do we think of? Prayer requests. I ask God, I tell Him what I want or what I need or think I need. Well, Jesus is going to get to that later on, but it's not where our prayer starts. We need to start with a focus on God, and it's not just random. That helps us have that perspective. I'm praying to God. I'm looking at Him, the one who wants to have this relationship, and in it He is in control and loves me. Things need to start that way. There is nothing wrong with reciting this passage from the Bible, but we need to realize it's meant to be more than that. This is meant to be a model for our prayer life, so we need to be aware of these elements, use them, and it will help us in our prayer time with God. And so I pray that's what happens over the course of these next several blogs.